Hi, good morning. Uh, Wherever you are, hopefully it's morning, evening, whatever, good afternoon. This is our newest release, Fig and Zig, and what we want to do is kind of give a brief overview, if you will, of this, and kind of explain the book because it attempts to address some of the physical laws of nature, through physics and whatnot. At the same time, it combines some idioms, nautical idioms, and throughout the book, and then it wraps up with a spiritual law revealed. And so, the basic concept is, for your child is, oh, okay, yeah, we have all these physical laws like gravity. We have a tendency to accept that, even though we can't see it, but we feel its effects, and we know that it can work to our benefit or against us. And so, well, the same thing is true of spiritual laws. You can't see them, but you know they're there. You should know they're there, and they impact, for better or worse, your well-being. And so, Fig and Zig, it's a fun little book. I included Sig here as part of it because along the way, I developed Sig as a character from some leftover words I didn't really have a use for. But I wanted to include him, in each page of the book. And so I figured, well, might as well include him here too. So anyway, I like Sig. He's a fun character, if you will. And so without further delay, we'll move into the next chart. So, yeah, here we go. So we have these physical laws. And so just to make it easy, and I put these in the front of the book so that you can know what order they'll appear throughout the story. But yeah, there's perpetual motion, which is really something that we pursue that does no one's been able to do it yet. But if you ever were able to do perpetual motion, you would solve a whole lot of problems associated with work and energy. And if you were to be able to do that, life would be much easier for us. So, but no one's done it yet. So until then, we're stuck with work, and we have to do energy. We have to expend some energy to accomplish work. So anyway, then there's horsepower, distance, friction, aerodynamic force, leverage, centrifugal force, aerodynamic stability. All of these here, potential energy, gravity, spin, those are all associated with a yo-yo. If you knew that all of that went into just a simple yo-yo. Kinetic energy, thermodynamics, force, motion, gravity, and friction, or the soapbox derby, gravity hill concept. Gravity hill is in Huntsville. There's a gravity hill in Huntsville. I actually went there one evening and parked the car on Gravity Hill, put the car in neutral, and it gave the illusion of rolling uphill. Now, I'm not sure if this particular Gravity Hill is actually a gravity hill or if it's just an optical illusion, but it worked. It does do that. And there are different sites and locations around the country, and I assume in the world, where if you do this, there are actual ones that really and truly there is no optical illusion associated with it. It's either magnetic or some other phenomena that the car will roll uphill, slowly but surely. And so, anyway, that's kind of an anomaly of the world that we live in, but it exists, And so the thing is that there's an explanation for it, and just like some of the laws that are spiritual laws may not actually, you may not understand them, or you may not believe that they could be true, but they actually are. And so anyway, that's basically the physical laws that we're going to cover in the book. So, yeah, like I said, here we go. We're in the beginning of the book. There's, these two twins, okay, Fig and Zig, and these two characters came about because I had a boss, and he had twins, twin daughters, and he was always telling me about. The only way we can tell these girls apart is we have different color earrings, because even their own kids. I mean, now I'm sure, he probably knew some other way, but in general, most people couldn't tell the children apart. Just total strangers or daycare operators or people who encounter these children. And so the kids, they figured out, well, what we can do, we can just swap out earrings and nobody, we can be, we can be each other, kind of thing. And so he was telling me about all that. I thought it was kind of humorous. And I thought, well, that'd be a nice set of characters. And so the only way you can tell Fig and Zig apart is by their letter, okay, on their hat or some other indicator. And so, in the beginning of the book, there's Sig, which is like same sounding word spelled differently, kind of twin words. And then there's the twin rainbows, and then these two characters. And like I say, they got the perpetual motion boat there on their outside their front door. And these two are basically from the beginning of the book to the end, they don't stop moving. So they got lots of energy and they got a pretty active imagination, which is something good. You want your children to have an imaginary thought life, a good one. And so these two guys are definitely that. And so and then the first, and so perpetual motion is really something has not been achieved. Okay, and even the closest thing that would come to be the void of space, but even there, the bodies, the celestial bodies and whatnot, they're subject to magnetic pull, wind, solar wind type things, like I say, gravitational pulls and stuff. And so, even a body that's moving through space eventually will, I guess, slow to the point that it slows down and stops. And so there's a theory out there that should the universe go on forever, assuming time is something you believe in. I mean, time is relative, I think. Length of time on a Mars, a day there is different than a day here, and so time is just a construct that we come up with to kind of order our life events. Things occur in a certain order. We make appointments, but perpetual motion is not hasn't happened, and so until it does, you know, okay, we're stuck with what we have. But it's a nice little toy. It's a nice little gizmo. It's something to think about. And then these two, like I say, I mean, the first the first adventure they have in the book is in a horse-drawn wagon or cart in this particular case. And so Zig here, he's got the reins. He's tearing out across the countryside, full speed or whatever. And so Sig, he's down there, he's calculating, displacement and distance. That's how you basically come up with uh, uh, distance is equal to speed times time. And so, you cover a certain distance in a certain period of time, you can figure out, what your speed is. And so in doing that, you're displacing yourself. You're moving from one place to another, right? And so, he's calculating that. And then, horsepower, and so my thing is, during the course of the book, it might be, best to say, oh, okay, this is what's going on. They're careening across the countryside, and this is the concept of horsepower, how you calculate horsepower. But in a child's world, keeping it simple is probably best, and so you don't. I mean, there's several points along the way in the book where if the child is like, "Oh, really? I got an interest in that," you may have yourself a budding mathematician or a scientist or engineer or something on your hands, and you may want to go further in depth. But like I said, the gist of the book is like to relate, oh, all these physical world laws and properties apply, and we have a tendency just to accept those. But when it comes to spiritual laws, well, we're not as easily convinced. And so the thing is this book is a kind of a way to draw your child towards those spiritual laws, like the ones where you would want to be honest and truthful and, you know, not deceptive. That's a spiritual law. And so anyway, it's a neat scene. It's a lot of fun. The 1D21 is the programmer's calculator. It's the way of calculating horsepower. You put those numbers in, it'll give you a hexadecimal number, which you can't enter decimal points in a programmer's calculator. But it's close. It's the representation. If you uh, three digits in a decimal, then you would have um, the equation for horsepower. And obviously, what they have here is 1 horsepower, and so it's equal to the amount of velocity divided by 234 times weight. It's how much that horse can work, it can accomplish. Yeah, so okay, so now here these guys are. Like I say, they got pretty good imagination, and so Sig, he's down there, he's calculating the properties of frictional force. Okay, and so the thing is, the guys in the boat with the oars, basically they are the equivalent of what you would call push. Okay, they're the force, if you will, and so you have weight and you have buoyancy. As long as the weight doesn't exceed the buoyancy, the ship won't sink or the boat won't sink. If you put too much weight in it, it'll go under. And so the thing is they're safe here. They haven't done that. But the force that's acting against them is drag, and it's based on the amount of friction, how much drag there is. And so the more drag, the more push you're going to need to move something. Later in the book, we talk about static friction, and how to overcome that. And so there's a force that you have to initially overcome, static friction, in order to achieve some type of movement. But in general, just keep it simple and just say, hey, the guys in the boat with the oars, they're the ones moving the boat, okay? And so anyway, it's a fun scene. I like this scene a lot. They got their little sailor outfits on, and the first clue that you get that there's something else going on here is the flags. Those flags actually stand, they're nautical flags, and they actually stand for, each one of them stands for a different letter in the alphabet. And so those flags actually spell something out. And so it's an alphabet and a language. The language is English, but it's an alphabet and it's English, but it's represented in a way you don't understand. And that's the way spiritual laws are. Sometimes, it's in English and it's using our alphabet, but you don't necessarily recognize it when you see it. And so, but eventually at the end of the book, it comes clear to them. And so then the next scene in the book is dealing with aerodynamic force. And so, have line tension and gravity is equal to lift and aerodynamic force. And so in between there and that point, you have thrust and drag. And so the guy on the ground down there, he's what we call runner. He's the guy running. He's creating tension and he's overcoming the force of gravity. When he runs, it creates there's drag that he's overcoming, but it creates a thrust, and so the thrust is what causes the kite to lift or whatever. And so that lift creates an aerodynamic force. And as long as that all stays in good shape, then everything's fine. But if you get to the point that lift begins to decrease, and it could decrease to a point where it doesn't really exist. And what you have is a stall condition, and the aerodynamic lift is lost, and the kite will begin to fall. And I've experienced that, flying kites, when I was a kid and stuff. And I still, go out with grandkids every now and then, and my children when they were growing up and fly kites. It's kind of something I don't know, as an adult, uh, kind of fun. When somebody says, go fly a kite, you should go fly a kite, okay? Because it kind of takes your mind off other stuff and it helps you kind of appreciate a simpler approach. But anyway, that kite will stall and begin to fall to the ground. And, what I'd have to do is I'd have to reel the string in, decrease the line and re-increase the tension and begin to run again. And if it caught, it would, it would lift and would go back up, and I would overcome it. And as long as the wind continued to blow, it would stay up, and I could let the string back out, the line out. And I've had kites that are up hundreds and hundreds of feet, way up in the sky, just amaze me. And the sad part of it is, you got that kite string, and it's not the best. It was cotton thread, basically two-strand cotton thread or something. And if it snapped, there goes your kite. It just kind of just floats off, you just get to sit there and watch it, disappear over the horizon. And it's kind of a sad moment. But, so buy good kite string. But the more kite string you buy, the better quality, the heavier. And so there's more of that, gravity pulling against the kite, because the weight is something you have to overcome. So there's a trade-off. But yeah, flying kites is a fun thing. The other thing that's depicted here is the balloons, and so the balloons float because the gas inside the balloon is lighter than the surrounding atmosphere, and so there's a pressure differential. We didn't really talk much about that in the book, but there's other examples of eagles soaring on, thermals and hot air balloons and things of that nature. There's a lot in here. I mean, like the kids on the maypole, that's a centrifugal force. There's and one of the next in the next slide we're going to talk about seesaw and the lever. And so, but yeah, there's a lots of things going on in the playground scene or the carnival scene here that you can talk about with your children. So yeah, like I mentioned, there's the adult there on the seesaw with the child, and this is something that's actually kind of beneficial. You may actually want to teach this to your children at some point. The fulcrum is actually something that would maybe perhaps be beneficial at some point, in case, especially if you ever needed to lift a heavy object. You can use leverage to do that, and you create a fulcrum. You get a pole or a plank or something. You put it under the heavy object, and you can lift that just with a force pushing down. You can lift a very heavy object, uh, that weighs more than yourself or whatever, just by applying a force. Now, the heavier the object, the more force it's going to take. So, I mean, you don't want to be going out and trying to, lift a, 5-ton car or truck or something with a piddly little fulcrum. But the thing is in other circumstances, I mean, if a tree were to fall on someone or something, or and you want to get the tree off of it, well, a fulcrum would be a great way to leverage that and to do it. And so the next example is centrifugal force. Now, centrifugal force is kind of interesting because you recognize centrifugal force whenever you're on a ride of some type, a merry-go-round or some type of maypole device or a carnival ride that goes around in a circle. The centrifugal force, you're being pulled away, and as long as something in the center retains, connection doesn't fail or whatever, well, you'll just fly around a circle, and so that's what's going on here. The children are the center of this, and they have hula hoops. And I don't even know if they make hula hoops anymore, but hula hoops were cool when we were kids. I mean, they're kind of mindless, but you'd play with hula hoops for hours. I guess they were good for exercising. Uh, but the object that's orbiting the stationary point, it will continue to do that until it develops enough force or some other event occurs that allows it to break free. If it were to break free, then it would just continue in a straight line from the object that it broke free from. The interesting aspect of that is that it would also continue to rotate in the direction it was rotating. And so, when you're thinking about, okay, how the planets formed and the fact that all this gas was rotating on a star and was thrown off, yeah, the star, well, that gas should rotate in the same direction as it was the object it was thrown off of or from. And there are planets in our solar system that actually rotate in an opposite direction or a direction not consistent with how the other objects in the solar system rotate. The explanation is that some outside force impacted them or whatever. And so I guess you could believe that. I mean, if there's not really any proof that that's what happened, but I mean, it's a theory and it seems reasonable and it's believable. But I prefer that God created the planets and they all rotate the way He wanted them to rotate. But whatever. I mean, I'm not here to convince somebody one way or the other on that. But I really like centrifugal force, and we talk about centrifugal force again here later in the book. So the next particular item is aerodynamic stability, and it doesn't get any better than a frisbee. Frisbee has it's spinning. It has forward motion, and it's pulling down. The air mass above it is pulling down. The air mass below it is pushing down. But because of its speed and its flight path, it kind of hovers or floats. And as long as it maintains that speed and velocity, that's what it'll do. But eventually, gravity, if it slows down enough, gravity will take over and it'll drop to the ground. Or if it flips, a breeze or something tilts it over or whatever, then it'll, drop to the ground. And, depending on how it hits the ground, it'll continue to roll until the spin is exhausted. And that leads you basically into the next concept of the yo-yo. There's a lot of um, physics, if you will, associated with the simple child's toy of the yo-yo. You got potential energy, you got gravity, you got spin, kinetic energy, directional momentum, all of the things listed here. And Fig, he's asking an interesting question. He's asking, well, you ever think about, you know, what makes a yo-yo go? And at the same time, he's thinking about little E that he just met. And so he's talking about one thing, but thinking about something else. He's pretty complex, right? And but yeah, the concept of a yo-yo is when you wind up the string around the yo-yo. Basically, what you're doing is you're storing energy. Okay, you're expending energy to roll it up and transferring that energy to the string. And so, the concept they would provide in school would be, use a jack or something. You would lift a heavy load and suspend it in the air, and you lock it in place. And then, so it would stay suspended there with that stored energy. Now, if the lock were to suddenly be released or fail, then that would come crashing down and release that stored energy that would have been stored. And that's basically what you're doing at yo-yo. You're releasing that stored energy in a downward motion, and it's picking up speed and velocity and spin as it goes down the string. And when it gets down to the end of the string, it's going to spin down there until you give it a little tug or whatever, and it'll rewind and it'll come back up the string, and then you can repeat the process. Now, you do that enough times, the string's going to get twisted. This is what always used to happen to me. The string get twisted, and pretty soon your yo-yo is going down the string a little tilted, So that's not necessarily the best situation because it could get down to the bottom and just kind of spin out down there, and you'd have to unspin it and rewind it and start over. But yo-yos are neat toys, and they're neat. I don't see many of them anymore, but it doesn't mean that they aren't out there. You just don't see kids playing with yo-yos, but they're really neat toys, and they have a lot of physics associated with them for an inquiring mind. And like I said, when you're reading this book, keep it simple. I mean, you don't have to go into a whole lot of detail. Unless child asks questions. If child asks questions, then you might want to be a little bit prepared. But in general, I'd keep it as simple as possible if I were you. And if they ask more, then yeah, there's other books. You can go research all of this stuff, especially when it comes to things like motion. Okay, and so then there's kinetic energy, and you know, when we were growing up, there was a game called marbles, and so marbles were pretty easy to come by. You put a nickel in a gumball machine, and you get a whole handful full of marbles. There were marbles that were big marbles, and we call them miggies. There were MIGs, and you could use a MIG to take out a bunch of marbles. And so sometimes, we just say no, you can't use a MIG because you wipe out somebody's marble collection. But marbles are pretty easy to come by, so and they weren't like they were real valuable. But there were certain marbles that were coveted. They had cat's eye marbles and different ones, and they were just beautiful. And they had black marbles with striations in them and that kind of thing. And so yeah, it was a fun game. But in this particular one, Zig here, his thing is marbles. He's good at marbles, and so he has his Miggy, and that's Fig's blue Miggy out there, and he's fixing to take it, and so, but he uses kinetic energy to do that. The Newton's law is basically a body at rest tends to stay at rest, and a body in motion tends to stay in motion. And so, what's going to happen here is Fig's Miggy's in rest along with all the other marbles, and Zig's Miggy is in motion. And when his Mig hits Fig's Mig, that energy's transferred, and he's able to knock Fig's Mig out of the circle, and by doing so, he gets to take possession of Fig's Mig. So it's a demonstration of kinetic energy, and there's a formula there for that. So I guess, like I say, just keep it simple. How far do you want to go? That's the thing that needs to be determined. The other aspect of this is, throughout, up until this point, there's been, I hope they know their ropes. In this particular ones, I'm taking them back. Eventually, this is associated with Zig taking the long shot. And these are all naval terms and idioms, if you will. And we're going to explain that when we get through with this part of it, just so, because it may not be clear, it's a language that we know what they mean, but child may not. What does that mean? So we're going to cover that so that, and you may not know. You may use these and not know what they mean. So anyway, there's that. So thermodynamics. Okay, so we talked a little bit about this previously, but not a lot. But the thermodynamics in this particular scene are, there's aerodynamics, as you can see by the kites and things in the background, but there's thermodynamics associated with the combustion engine. And basically, a small amount of fuel is released into a cylinder and ignited, and it creates an explosion, if you will, or a fire, and causes the piston to move. And the piston transfers that energy to the gear, which goes to the wheel and causes, depending on the position of the gear, the wheel will either go forward or it go backwards. And that's just a general. There's a lot more going on. But it goes to show, well, we don't really have to, understand how a combustion engine works in order to know that a combustion engine works, right? We can see it working, we can experience it. And so that's the same thing with the spiritual laws. We don't really have to know too much about how they work. We just know that they do work, and which is kind of interesting. And then, the illustration next to that is, right before the racetrack scene or the soapbox derby scene. They're all lined up, ready to go there. But it has examples of thermodynamics. The air in the balloons is warmer, hotter than the air surrounding air, so it causes the balloon to float. Now, if the air becomes light enough, it'll overcome the weight that's holding it down, and it'll begin to float up. And as long as that air stays hot, it'll continue to float upward. But as soon as it begins to cool down, or it reaches pressure equilibrium, it will begin to descend. And barring hopefully in a good way. And so, and then the eagles they're here. We like birds. We include birds in our books. You may not be a person who's really into birds. That's okay. But around here we have different types of birds, and some of them they'll get on the thermals. You'll see that in the summer and the spring, the thermals there'll be hot pockets of air rising upward off of asphalt or something, and it's warmer than the surrounding air. And so they'll ride those thermals, that steady stream of warm air. But they won't hardly ever flap their wings. They just have their wings stretched out, and they just ride those thermals higher and higher and higher. And you go out there and early in the day you can see them pretty clear, but you go out later in the day, man, they're like way up there, little dots kind of thing. And it's got to be wonderful to be that bird. I mean, it just float up like that. That's got to be like you know, wonderful experience. And I'm not sure. I guess one of them figured it out once, and now all of them know it or something. But maybe it's something that comes natural to them. But on top of that, the hidden clue here is you have Fig and little e, and Fe is a symbol for iron. And so, if you're looking at the element chart, this is a great way to introduce your kids to elements, like hydrogen and the gases and different ones. And then you can move into the more like gold and silver and iron and those kind of things. And then the more heavier elements like and radioactive elements, even uranium and different ones. Well, they all have a symbol, and each one of them has an atomic weight. And so the atomic weight for iron is Z26. And so, that's just another lesson, another talking point that you can have with your kid, if they're inclined in that direction. I always found that kind of stuff interesting when I was growing up, the atomic weights and the element tables and stuff. I thought it was neat. And ever so often, they would add a new element, so it was kind of a age of discovery when I was growing up that they would like, oh, we have a new element, and they add it to the chart. Um, the point of all this is the three of these together, they're iron. They are iron. They are the example of one for all and all for one. And so they're all working together to be friends and to compete, but it's all in good fun. It's not like competitive in a sense that got to win at all costs kind of thing. So that's yet another lesson that seems to be missing some these days. Yep. Okay. So we have force, motion, gravity, and friction. Okay. So there's a lot going on here, but basically they're building these soapbox derbies, cars, and they're just gravity powered cars. Gravity is the um, force, if you will, and so there are other forces. You know, electrical forces. You're familiar with those. Electricity is an interesting force and causes things to react in certain ways. And there's magnetic forces. There's pull from like opposite pole magnetic items will attract, and similar magnetic pole objects will repel. And so I always found that kind of to be fun to take two magnets that were opposite and try to put them together, and it would repel, it would push back against. So if you could solve that um, um concept, you could create a levitation device, and that would remove friction from the equation. Like, say, if you had a car that would just use the magnetic field to levitate, you wouldn't need tires. I mean, other than when it was parked or when you were coming in for a landing or something. but your tires last forever, so something to think about. I mean, there's lots of different ways of thinking about something like that and how it would be, um, applications for it. But transporting product, goods, services, people, things of that nature, friction is the one of the forces that really limits your ability to move quickly. And so that's identified here, friction. The other little device that's identified here is the unicycle. Now, Fig and Zig, they got bikes and they got two-wheel bicycles, but little E, she's riding around on a unicycle. And so, the unicycle incorporates a lot of other, and it's not really identified as the thing here, but I thought it was worth mentioning. It requires balance. And so, balance is kind of a acquired thing. Also, I never was really good at the unicycle. I didn't. I could go for a little distance, but not no, no. But I had friends, man. They could get on those things and go, and you just tilt a little bit one way, it goes that direction. Tilt another way, or you could just slow the thing down to stall, stop, if you will, and with good balance, and you can just pedal backwards and go backwards. Which is kind of uneasy feeling. I mean, you can't see where you're going. I've always thought, well, it'd be easier just to turn around, but some guys like to go back, forward, back, forward. But anyway, that's an interesting device too, and there's a lot of physics associated with that. Um, but okay, so Lily, she wins the race. Okay, so she gets to go to the winner's circle. She gets the winner's cup, if you will, but she also gets the invitation. And the invitation is for everybody. Most Christians recognize 3:16 as, for God so loved the world. And so that's when this book begins to kind of transition into, um, we've covered all these spiritual laws, we've covered all these spiritual aspects to the book, and it's fixing to cross over into, you know, not spiritual, physical laws. We're fixing to cross over into the more spiritual aspect of this. And so, stay tuned. So here they are. Um, I threw this in here because, my granddaughter once she had a bunch of checkers and she was putting square pegs in the round circles. And I thought, well, that's how you put square pegs through a round hole. She solved that at 2 years old. So I thought it was kind of humorous. And so these kids, though, these are the next generation behind Fig and Zig, and they're just as inquisitive. They're solving problems. They're figuring out the world, the physical world around them. And this is what you want. You want your. It's. I think it's difficult to experience these types of things from a video. Not to say that you can't learn from those, but at some point you have to have an application, a physical application. Either like you have to make the cake or work up the recipe or conduct the experiment or something like that. So you have to have be able to relate to your physical world. And at this particular point in their lives, when they're young like this, that's the physical world is better or worse. That's what they have. That's how they relate to what's going on. So anyway, I just thought this was kind of a neat little fun chart or fun illustration. We have the spiritual aspect of this, and so the thing is um, God loves you. Okay, He loves you. He loves your family. He loves your children, and that's the whole idea behind the invitation 3:16 is that He loved so loved the world. These flags, these nautical flags, well, it's a different alphabet. It's a uh, each flag represents a different letter in the alphabet. Okay, so each one of these letters flags represents a different letter. So the first one in the series there is the blue, yellow flag. Well, that's G. And then the second letter, you can see it occurs three times. It's the yellow triangle, red triangle, and it's O. And so, you got G, O, and then you got the second letter of the second word is O, and the second letter of the third word is O. And so the thing is, if it were a cryptogram, you might have enough to solve it. I mean, if you kind of understood that, God loves you, and so you might, but that's what it translates into. And so sometimes, the answer that, that God loves you is right there in front of you, right there in plain sight. You don't recognize that. You don't see it. You don't, it's not as clear to you as some of the other physical laws and rules. Say, for instance, like we mentioned, gravity. I mean, you let go of something that's going to fall to the ground. Well, some of the spiritual laws that exist, well, they're just as real, and the consequences of either using them or not using them is just as real. I mean, you can ignore gravity and jump off the garage. Well, okay, not a good idea. you know, that levitation device that we were talking about has not been created yet, so you're not going to be able to just float easily, down to the ground. But that's the whole idea behind this particular page. And so that's how the book wraps up. I mean, you go through a whole lot of physical laws, and there's an explanation for those. But in the end, what you want to do is communicate to your child, God loves you, and there are spiritual laws. And the same as, like you say, there are physical laws, there are spiritual laws, and they're just as real. And so you need to instill that though early, in their life. So I think it's a good book. I hope you enjoy it. Well, if you had enough, that's fine. I need to at least explain some of the idioms that are used here, and then I was going to talk about safety a little bit because, I want to be safe. Okay, so here we are. We have the nautical idioms, and they're listed there. This is the order in which they appear in the book, by and large, hope to know the ropes, that kind of stuff. And, each one of these started out as some type of nautical term or whatever. And, over time, some of them still mean what they meant then, but, they've evolved. They don't have the same literal meaning that they had um, when they were originally created, if you will, or used. And so the thing is in general, like one like in the doldrums. Well, that not a lot happening. But what's a doldrum, right? So, but yeah, so it's that kind of thing. So anyway, without too much delay, we'll move over to that. So yeah, by and large, and by is close to the wind, and large is with the wind at your back. And so by and large is just a phraseology that we use. I hope they know their ropes. That guy was here the other day giving me an estimate on some work. And I was like, I was showing him this book, and I said, yeah, I'm talking about this idiom. I said, I hope they know their ropes. I said, it's kind of like I feel about you. I hope you know what you're doing, kind of thing. I hope you know your process, and I hope you know what you're doing, and I hope it's not going to be a problem for me. And then feeling blue, fly a blue flag for sadness or melancholy. They would fly a blue flag on the mast of the ship if someone died, like the captain or someone when there was some other reason that they were not happy. And then the doldrums would kind of mention that, stagnation, lack of progress, taken aback, the sails would sometimes would blow back against the mast, and that would cause the ship to go in the opposite direction, which is kind of an interesting thing. Taking a long shot, everybody knows taking a long shot. It's like just a Hail Mary, if you will, is maybe equivalent of that. You got nothing to lose. Might as well, and that's what they do. They fire a cannonball up in the air and hope they hit something. Cannonballs aren't like um, very directional. You hit one off, and depending on how, launch one, and depending on how it's made, it might rotate to the left or right, or it might fly straight. Who knows? Turning blind eyes, willingly ignoring information. You just don't, you pretend you don't see it. Figs always seem so aloof. Uh, Steer away from dangers, the gist of it. But Fig was always kind of emotionally detached from, he didn't get, he's a logical thinker, so he's just kind of, he thinks about things kind of differently than everyone else. And then he shows his true colors. Pirate ships in the past, they would sail up on you with friendly colors, and then at the last minute they'd take down their colors and hoist the Jolly Roger, and that's when you would know, uh-oh, we have a problem. So yeah, and this, it could be a positive thing or a negative thing. Sometimes, um, most oftentimes it's associated with some negative event, but in general, it could be a positive thing that somebody reveals themselves to be, um, you know, something positive in your life, like your benefactor, or, you know, someone who's actually trying to do something good for you and you didn't know it. So, yeah. So that helps. These translations, that helps the child understand, some of these idioms. We use lots of idioms in the books, different ones in different books. And this is just our nautical one, since, Fig and Zig, they start out in a boat. You figure, well, what the heck, might as well carry the book. So, okay, so we don't want anyone to get hurt. Okay, so we want to be kind, we want to be safe, and we want to be respectful. And so the thing is, I thought, well, this is probably a good idea to go over some safety tips, because sometimes, somebody might read something and get the wrong idea and that kind of stuff. This is a book; it's imaginary world, but we live in a real world, and so accidents happen. So you want to try to communicate to your child, oh, okay, this is an instance where you might want to consider, knee pads or goggles or something. There's some of that goes on in the book, when they're wearing helmets and that kind of thing. But in general, not a lot of safety gear. So I'm gonna talk about that a little bit, because with the place I work, safety is a big deal. So big deal. You're constantly have situational awareness. So anyway, so yeah, the one the one thing you want to do is, if you're doing something, you want to keep your mind on what you're doing. You don't want to be distracted. You don't want to be distracted by other people or other things. That's why it's like, I mean, I kind of get it, riding around on a bicycle with a Walkman to your head. I mean, but as long as you're paying attention, I think that's good. But I always found the fewer distractions, if you're taking away your hearing capability and you're riding a bicycle in traffic, well, you won't know necessarily if there's an emergency vehicle or somebody coming up behind you, or honking their horn. You may not hear that. And so, you don't want to be distracted, okay? So you want to avoid complacency, and I found that's one of the things that's the greatest enemy. Is I've done this 20 times, I've done it 50 times, I've done it 100 times. I know what I'm doing, and you get complacent, and then pretty soon you not thinking. So you need to think before you act. You want to make sure you wear proper gear. Make sure you're aware of your situation. Like the kids with the frisbee, you want to stay out of the line of fire. Okay, you don't want to get hit with a frisbee. So if people are throwing a football or hitting baseballs or golf balls, or throwing frisbees, you don't want to be out there in the field of fire. You might get hit by something. So the same thing happens in life. I mean, you want to keep yourself out of the line of fire. If there are moving objects around you, well, you want to keep your feet out of it, or your hands out of it, or your body out of the line of fire. You want to learn from the past. You want to learn from past experiences. When you go to do the same task again, you want to be sitting there going, "Wow, oh, okay, this happened once," or you know, "This happened to someone else. I don't want it to happen to me or my family or anyone, and so we're going to do this." And so it's a good frame of mind to be in, not being in a hurry. Okay, and these last two, I put these in here because they seem to go together. You get frustrated, you get behind, or you get delayed or something, and then you begin to rush. Or the opposite is you start rushing and it's not working out like you want it to, and you get frustrated. And so when that happens, um, you know, you have a tendency to not be paying attention to these other things like situational awareness or staying out of line of fire or remembering the past. You tend to forget that. Um, you're having a difficult time with drilling this or cutting that and or doing something, and so you work to defeat the gear, which is there for to save you. Now, that's the other thing too. Is there a lot of safety features built into things, but you can't say, well, it's someone else's responsibility to think about my safety. Now, that's a thought process, and it's understandable that people have it, but ultimately, you're responsible for your own safety. You're responsible for your children's safety. So you have to. There's two concepts here. You have to be aware and you have to beware. And so to be aware, you have to like be thinking about where you are and what your situation is. And beware, you have to really recognize when there's danger and avoid that if possible. So I just thought it would be good to cover some of that because it is a fun hearted book. It's a lot, but you don't want people to get to thinking, oh, okay, yeah, I'm indestructible or something, just because they saw Fig and Zig, having fun. So, so yeah, like you say, beware. Think before you act. Think about okay, what could possibly go wrong with what I'm about to do, and we hear all the time, oh, I knew I shouldn't do that, or I thought about it before I did it, and I did it anyway, or okay. But the worst situation is just don't think at all. You just do things, and if you do that often enough, you're gonna have a problem. And so, just think about what you're doing. Think about it before you do it, and think about that there are physical laws. A lot of times once you put these laws in motion, there's not a lot going to keep them from happening. Okay, so just realize, there's always a point along the way, well, usually, where you can step back. You can say, okay, oh, wait, going to step back, not going to do this, going to wait, think about it a minute, and that kind of thing. And then if you make a decision to go forward, then go forward. If not, well, then do something different. Yeah, okay, so yeah, this is my fun part. I think it's always good to include others. I think they're, like you say, that little Lee comes along, they invite her to be part of the group or whatever. And, it's always good to be inclusive from my perspective because you get different points of view and you get a different perspective. And so different points of view might bring some benefit to interpreting some of the physical laws that are around you um, with a different slant, if you will. Not that it's going to change the law. I mean, I always have a difficulty with, oh, somebody discovered, um, you know, let's say Cuba. Well, no, they didn't discover it. It was always there. You just became aware that it was there. And so the people that were there, assuming there were people there, they knew it was there. And, it's like the place you came from, they discovered that. And so it's always good to have different points of view and look at things from a different perspective. And so by including others, that's how you'll do that. So I think that's a good lesson that comes out of the book is, to be inclusive. And, by all means, be respectful, don't belittle someone. And listen to God. God is speaking to you through your conscience. Most everyone I know has one at some point. They may get to the point where they don't listen to it much anymore, but they at some point had a conscience, and it's a good thing to listen to that conscience. Um, the invitation is there. Okay, it's there for you, it's there for your children, it's there for people you know. And so, you just issue the invitation and let God do the rest. Okay, it's not like you have to do a whole lot. Okay, you just, and so if by sharing, one of these books or sharing a family event or invite them to your community gathering or church or whatever, um, you never know. Could be the thing that makes a difference, in a person's life. And that's how we overcome some of our more primal societal behaviors, if you will, is by learning that there's more to life than meets the eye. Okay, so yeah, this is one of my favorite scenes because in the end of the book, these guys are there. They're celebrating. They're in the winner's circle. They've accepted the invitation, and they're God so loved the world, right? And so but uh, they're still friends. Okay, I mean, all day long they played this or that, and some won, one lost, one didn't, one whatever. But none of that matters. It's just like we're okay, and they're not harboring any ill will toward one another or whatever. So, like I say, it's something that's rare these days to see somebody be a good sport. I mean, sometimes you see it in athletics or whatever, but in the work environment, there's not a whole lot of good sports stuff going on. There's a lot of competition, and even when people win, they're not very friendly about it sometimes. So don't be that person. Be a good sport, teaching your child early in life to be a good sport, and let it play out the way it plays out. I found that it always works out the way it's going to work out. There's not, doesn't change anything, and just be an example to other people about how you should be. And yeah, like in this particular case, you have, uh, it's the same old language. It's just represented differently. So it might be a poor choice of words here. But, God loves you is the message. And it's presented in a way that may not be recognized, but he does still love you. Okay. And so the thing is that's what you basically want to communicate is that, um, these flags communicate a message. It's in the English language. It's using the English alphabet, but and so it may not translate well in other areas, but God does love you in other countries, and maybe they have their own flag system with their own alphabet, and they could put together something similar. But the thing is always be willing to learn. I learned a lot when I was doing this book about these different flags and the different words associated with each one and the letters associated with each one. And I'm like, oh, well, you can send messages with these. So anyway, this is what the book is. I like the book. We like the book a lot here at Skinny, and I hope you will like it too. And so, just remember, send us your comments or get in touch with us if you have questions. And until next time, I appreciate your patience. Take care.